Welcome to the Fit Strong Women Over 50 podcast, episode number 127. Welcome. I'm Chris. Thank you for joining us.
And I'm Jill. Chris and I are your co-hosts for this podcast and the founders of the Becoming Ellie community. As the legend goes, Ellie was the Norse goddess of aging who beat Thor in a wrestling match. We decided to name our community after her because we were inspired to be more like Ellie.
You can find out more about the Becoming Ellie community and this podcast at our website, becomingellie.com. And Ellie is spelled E-L-L-I.
Be sure to sign up for our newsletter while you're there. That way you'll know about new episodes and anything else that's new in our world.
Today's episode is a great talk about how food supports emotional well-being.
Yes, today we're talking to Mary Beth Albright, the author of Eat and Flourish. She shares lots of information with us.
I think you'll enjoy hearing what she has to say. Let's go to the podcast.
Mary Beth Albright is the author of Eat and Flourish, How Food Supports Emotional Well-Being. She is a food expert with broad experience from food attorney to being a finalist on Food Network Star, where she competed on Iron Chef America.
Her passion for good food grew from her mentor, Surgeon General C. Everett Koop, who she worked for 15 years. Afterwards, Mary Beth advised on food systems and managed a White House initiative. She completed L'Academie de Cuisine's 2-semester culinary course in Bethesda, Maryland.
Mary Beth is a writer and editor at the Washington Post. She is also a frequent panel moderator, including for the U.S. State Department and the Smithsonian, and her food judging expertise is sought regularly, including the time she ate 2,000 foods in 3 days to judge the Outstanding New Products Awards. That had to be a lot of fun. She is an elected member of L'Academie de Cuisine, an esteemed group of women in the culinary professions, which counts Julia Child among its alumnae.
Oh, wow. Mary Beth lives in Washington, D.C. with her 10-year-old son, Truman, who wants to know if you want to talk about baseball.
Welcome, Mary Beth.
Thank you so much for having me.
I would love to talk about baseball with Truman, but we'll have to do that another time. But I would love to have that conversation.
He's not home right now. He's at school. So, yeah.
So you are a chef, a scientist, a journalist, and all-around food expert. We're so happy to get to talk with you. So on our podcast, we talk a lot about food for health, for physical health. We talk about, cardiovascular health, cognitive health, but we don't very often talk about food for emotional well-being. So how does food affect our emotions? It's a big question, I know.
No. Start with the top of the funnel and we'll move on down.
Okay.
Yeah, it's interesting because only over the past 20 years have we really seen the influx of peer-reviewed research that shows that food and mood are entwined like vines, and you can't separate them. The human body is more than just a container for parts. And what happens in one part of our human body system affects the rest of the human body system. And now, because of the past 20 years of research, we have actual science about how food affects mood.
Is there like a reverse of this where the emotions affect our food choices?
Yeah. And I refer to it as a Mobius strip. I don't know if you know what a Mobius strip is. It's a 3D image that has one edge, which seems like it's irrational and crazy, but it all leads...
Like a figure 8 that's twisted?
Correct.
Is that infinity symbol kind of?
Absolutely. And
is that what I'm thinking of?
Yeah. And if you find a sculpture of a Mobius strip, you put your hand on one end and you keep going around and your hand ends at the same place. It's sort of like a brain teaser kind of thing. But it's because how we eat affects our emotional well-being and mental health. And our emotions affect how we taste food, because flavor is created in the brain, and it has to do with all of the different things that are happening around us and inside of our brain. So, for example, we have a central nervous system, our brain and our spinal cord. And through that central nervous system, we can touch things and see things and smell things, right? But when we taste something on our tongue, it's not just about what's happening on the tongue or even just what's happening in our nose, because a lot of people know that scent is a big part of flavor, but it's also what we're hearing. It's also what we feel and how the food hits our mouth. It's called mouth geometry. It's a whole branch of science. So that's why I'm saying there's a lot in the book about neurogastronomy, which is the study of how flavor is created in the brain. And for the book, I did some research with Dr. Eric Stice out of Stanford University, and he researches what happens in people's brains when they eat milkshakes. So he puts people through a functional MRI machine, and then you just eat a milkshake and you watch your brain activity. So I showed up on his doorstep asking to be scanned. I spent an hour and a half in an fMRI because I also brought some wine and some kale juice to see what the differences were in my brain activity. And
so, interesting.
Oh, completely. And so that's why, and that's just one of the very multiple ways that food can show up in our brain activity, and it can change our brains and the way that we experience things.
I assume there was a difference between the kale and the wine and the milkshake. Was there a difference between the wine and the milkshake?
Yeah. And a lot of it is about the expectation that we bring to things, right? I mean, all of us know that foods that we had during our childhood are still meaningful to us now. Those comfort foods, even if they don't taste as good as when we tasted them when they were a child, they still have meaning to us. And so a lot of it is about the association that you have with wine. A lot of it is about the association you have with milk, with milkshakes and with kale juice. And so if you go back to sort of the beginnings of us eating, we get something that's called a reminiscence bump from anything that was really pre 20 years old, maybe even 25 years old, that we have a comfort food association with. But because of neuroplasticity, because our brains can change, and there's something called the Hebb's postulate, which is neurons that wire together, fire together. And so that's just the idea of brain plasticity, that you can learn new things. And so a lot of this book is about teaching yourself to relearn those comfort foods. And there's a lot of science behind that too.
Oh, wow. Okay. So when a person is depressed, they are told to start walking and that you'll feel better. Get out there and move. You'll feel better. But a person who is depressed may know that and really struggle to actually do it. And I suspect the same thing is true with food.
Absolutely. And I thank you for the observation, because it's a really important one. A lot of, you can't just tell somebody, oh, you're depressed, eat 3 walnuts, you'll feel great in the morning, right? Or, well, you're really upset, have a salad instead of ice cream. Like I come from the background of being a food writer. I am obsessed with deliciousness. I love food myself. And so that's what I thought was really important to bring to this book and to the study of how food affects mood, which is also called nutritional psychology. It's a burgeoning field that's really grown over the past 15 years. So from my perspective, I come at this book as an eater, not as a researcher, not solely as a journalist, but I come at this book as an eater who says, when I get upset and I'm having some ice cream, that there is a real biological effect to that. And I know that. And instead of fighting that biology, we need to know it and make friends with it. And when we know more about our own biology, we can start addressing it. So in the back of the book, there is a 4-week plan for starting to explore different ways that you can eat to affect your emotional well-being. And a big part of that is increasing food pleasure. One of the things that we were just talking about, because if you increase the pleasure that you're getting out of that bowl of ice cream, it is less likely that you will get to that ice cream again and again and again, right? Because that's what all the fMRI things showed, the studies of brains. And so to get to that, increasing food pleasure can be as easy as making sure that you put something into an actual bowl rather than eating it out of the carton. Now, so for some people, carton, it increases their food pleasure, right? There's a sort of like naughtiness about it, right? But I'm trying to get away, and I think we're all trying to get away from that diet culture that assigns good or bad to how we eat, right? Because if we keep thinking about the ice cream as naughty, and we keep thinking about the vegetables as virtuous, we're never going to learn to like those vegetables. And our brains are ready to do that. But a lot of times we say to ourselves, oh, okay, I'm going to be good today, and I'm going to have some broccoli or salad or whatever. And then we don't put anything on top of it. And I get it that there are all kinds of like studies about like, oh, the fats and salad dressings and stuff. But if it stops you from eating vegetables, you are letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. And all of the science shows that you need to have that pleasure. Pleasure is a form of human nourishment, and we can learn to love these things if we just give ourselves a chance to.
That's a good point.
What about stress? Does the food we eat affect the stress? And could it cause the stress?
It can. And one of the things about food and mental health and food and emotional well-being is that there are a lot of pathways between our gut and our brains and our mental health. And so sometimes it can be difficult to take something and say, this is the one mechanism that rules it all. This is the one thing I have to change, and then everything will be fine. And it's just not like that. I mean, it is complicated. And all of the studies, short of putting a webcam on someone's head 24/7 and seeing everything that they eat, it's very difficult to do this kind of science and expensive, right? So, we all know that the lick of the brownie batter spoon matters, right? Matters in science, but there is a particular pleasure in that brownie batter. So, especially off of a spoon, a lot of times eating something off of a spoon people will rank as higher satiety than eating something out of a bowl. It really depends on learning about yourself.
Sort of like the batter beaters.
Yeah.
That's the childhood memory of getting the beater from your mom or whatever to lick.
That's exactly right. And because the human body is more than a container for parts, it is a system. And everything in the system affects everything else. And those memories from childhood will affect how much pleasure you get out of something. As I said, we all have those foods that, we loved as kids, and we go back and eat them and we're like, but it means so much to me. You know what I mean? Like objectively, I'm not sure this tastes very good, but it really brings up something. So it's about retraining ourselves and teaching ourselves our own comfort foods every single day.
Interesting.
Yeah, it is.
All right. So food can have an effect on our emotional well-being short term, but can it affect us long term?
Yes, absolutely. So as I said, I start with pleasure in the book because that's where I come from. I come from a place of like, I love food. And so we talk a lot about that, but then I go on for the next 3 chapters to talk about 3 other parts of eating for emotional well-being. One of those is inflammation. Now, inflammation anywhere in the body can affect your emotional well-being. And what I mean by that is if you sprain your ankle, there will be inflammation in that area. Those inflammatory compounds, teeny little inflammatory compounds that are produced from that inflammation, go into your bloodstream. And we used to think that the brain was completely protected from all the toxins in our blood by something called the blood-brain barrier. And about 20 years ago, we learned that the blood-brain barrier is not impenetrable. It is semi-permeable, meaning that little tiny things that are floating around in your blood, these little tiny compounds, can get through and affect your brain. And when these inflammatory compounds get into your brain, they can wreak havoc on your emotional well-being. And again, that's about inflammation that happens anywhere in the body. You cut your finger, it swells, it gets red, it gets warm. That's inflammation. That's your immune system at work.
Right.
Yeah. And the other way that it affects, and I mentioned the part about the immune system is because when we eat, for example, ultra high processed foods, there are a number of even the foods that look like they're very simple, right? Like, 5 ingredients or whatever. A lot of these foods are made with industrially processed ingredients. So for example, if you see on the back of a box, like canola oil and or safflower oil and or vegetable oil, right? They're just the company uses the least expensive ingredient. And it could be any one of those on a specific day, whatever the commodity prices are, like that's the ingredient that they're going to use. And the way that they produce that, and look, the company is there to make money. Like
right.
that's what they do. And we all know that. So the industrial process that goes into mass producing oils like this changes the chemical makeup of the oil into something that oftentimes your body reacts to it with inflammation. And when that happens, this is a way that food directly can increase your inflammatory profile and therefore affect your emotional well-being. Now, there are a lot of reasons to worry about inflammation that aren't about your emotional well-being, but in this book, I'm focused on just how it affects emotional well-being. And so staying away from those ultra high processed foods is a really, really great start. And it could be the finish, right? I mean, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
So I'd like to go back to the inflammation.
Yeah.
A little bit more. Is that all right?
Yeah, we could talk all day about inflammation. My gosh.
Well,
yes.
Can you talk a little bit about how the inflammation affects your emotional well-being?
Well, that's when there's inflammation anywhere in the body. That inflammation, there are a lot of different things that happen. As I said, it's your immune system at work. You cut your finger, it gets red, it gets swollen, it gets warm. Those reactions, that red, swollen, and warm, have biological consequences. One of them is that they produce inflammatory compounds that go into your bloodstream. When those inflammatory compounds go through your bloodstream and pass the blood-brain barrier, those inflammatory compounds get into the blood that's circulating around your brain, and it can really affect and damage.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
It does. So here's the interesting thing about this book, I think, is that 1 foot, you are in the most ancient recommendations. Eat vegetables, eat fruits, have legumes and nuts and a diversity of foods. With the other foot, you are in the most cutting edge science, because all of this, if you look at the book, I've got pages and pages of references in the back. Most of those studies are from the past 15, 20 years. Because this is something, once we mapped the human genome in the early 2000s, and we figured out that pretty much all of us are 99.9% the same, researchers started looking for other things that influence us. And one of them that they found that is deep in research right now is the gut microbiome, which is another chapter of the book that we can get to. I mentioned pleasure, I mentioned inflammation. Then we talk about the gut microbiome. So the gut microbiome is the collection of trillions of bacteria that exist trillions of microbes that exist in your digestive tract. And that's your mouth all the way down to the other end. And these microbes, it's bacteria and it's fungi and it's viruses and archaea. These microorganisms, every single one of those trillion is its own living thing. It's not human. You have microbial cells inside of your body, and every single one of those cells eats and digests and produces waste, metabolites, right? And that's happening inside of your body right now. Inside, everyone who's listening to this has a microbiome, and everyone's microbiome is different. It's like a fingerprint. And there are lots of ways to have a healthy gut microbiome, but the species and amount of specific kinds of bacteria that are helpful for health outcomes, including mental health outcomes, but a lot of different health outcomes, are influenced by the food you eat. And so when we eat things like fiber, when we eat things like fermented foods, that feeds our gut microbiome and increases the likelihood that we will have better health outcomes mentally and physically.
You talk about something in your book that I did not ever realize.
Yeah.
And that is if you start adding like probiotics and whatever you start taking probiotics. Mm-hmm. You are not actually populating new bacteria into your gut. They're like passing through saying, good job, and sort of helping out a little.
You mean like the pills?
Or anything.
Probiotics or anything.
Anything, food too. Yeah, go ahead.
Your microbiome is what it is. Basically, I mean, there's whatever bacteria and whatever lives there, and the probiotics don't just move in. And
that's right.
I did not know that.
your digestive tract is like a factory, right? And the food is the raw materials. And this factory that you have is lots of little workers, these trillions of microbes, who live there and who take up residence there. And that starts the minute that you come out of the womb, either through C-section or through vaginal delivery. And evidence shows that those two have a very different gut microbiome, right? Gut microbiome results. But when you take a probiotic or eat yogurt or eat fermented food, that's a different kind of bacteria that will visit and will help all the workers, right? They'll do great things while they're there, but they don't take up residence. They come out the other end.
They're like contractors.
They're like contractors. They're like, yes, they're like specialists. Or like, those annoying people who come into the office as like organizational,
just visiting.
Yeah, right. Firing everybody and then coming out the other end. But it's true. And so I think, I've wondered to myself why that isn't more common knowledge. And I think that it is probably because the people who are selling either the food or the probiotics, it just muddies the waters, right? If people are like, wait, I'm going to eat this and then it's going to be gone a few hours later. That said, I focus on food, not pills. So the yogurt and the fermented foods will really, really help your gut microbiome, not just through those microbes that they have, but also through a lot of the fiber that they provide, because that's what your microbes eat. They eat fiber. And if you don't give them enough to eat, they will start eating the lining of your digestive organs, which can lead to leaky gut syndrome, which is associated with mental health issues.
A very good reason to eat lots of fruits and vegetables, right?
Totally.
And less processed food.
Yes. And
no processed food.
We have so many reasons to eat them, but we don't incorporate the pleasure part. And so that's why, to me, that was the cornerstone of the book. It had to talk about pleasure.
So about pleasure, you do recommend in your book that a person eat at least one meal a day with other people.
Yeah.
Which makes a lot of sense. So rather than eating at your desk or watching TV or whatever. I live alone, so I sort of wonder what you suggest for people like me, because I tend to eat a lot of meals where I plop my book in front of me and eat my dinner.
Oh yeah, and I live alone too, so I hear you on this. And I had written a story about this for the Washington Post at one point, and I got a lot of replies like that. That it was like, look, sure. I don't have, not that this is what you're saying, but I don't have anyone to eat with. Right. And so the reason that it's important to eat with somebody else at least once a day, if it is possible, is because whenever you eat anything, your body produces dopamine, and dopamine helps with bonding. And we see throughout the world that we are in a loneliness epidemic, and it's hard to talk about because nobody likes to admit that they're lonely. I'm lonely some of the time. I'll be the first one. I'll break the seal to talk about it. I'm lonely some of the time. And the current U.S. Surgeon General has said that we are in a loneliness epidemic, and that loneliness reduces lifespan equivalent to 10 cigarettes a day.
Oof.
So I know. And so it's a pain in the neck to go out and eat with somebody if you're just alone. I will go to a coffee shop or place that has a communal table and just sit with other people. It doesn't have to be a direct one-on-one, or even like at work, I will leave my desk and go and sit in the kitchen. Even if nobody else is with me, I'm just around people, right? And I think even those small steps can make a huge difference, because otherwise, and look, I love eating alone too. My gosh, I love reading a book or watching TV while I'm eating. But as a pattern, as the pattern that you live your life by, it's not associated with great mental health outcomes. And this is something that other countries really know about that we haven't caught on to a lot in America. In the United Kingdom, they have a whole program called the Big Lunch, that the only reason it exists is to get people to eat together. That's it. Doesn't matter what you eat, just eat together. And so I'm hoping that this science will catch on in the United States, because man, do we need it.
Yeah.
I have a friend who also lives alone, and she frequently goes to a restaurant and sits at the bar to eat her dinner.
Yeah.
And she doesn't know the people there, but she chats with either the bartender or the person next to her or whatever. So that's actually, she's doing something beneficial for her mental health there.
Oh, yeah. And I love eating at the bar. If you're going to eat alone, I feel like eating at the bar is the way to go because people will come in and out, will change the seats next to you. And I'm not somebody who loves just like striking up a conversation with a person next to me. Like, I know that's kind of creepy, right? But like you can feel out the vibe and then you get this like constant flow of people coming through. But I'm glad that your friend does that because it's extraordinarily important.
And I guess, there is no reason why you can't invite people to your house occasionally.
Well, and this is also true because in America, I think globally, really, we've conflated having people over with entertaining. I mean, this happened to me when I
turned into a big deal, right?
Right. That you feel like you have to do like a 4-course meal whenever people come over. And I think part of it is due to the rise of food television, that now we all have these like great expectations. Invite someone over for a cup of coffee. Invite someone over for like some muffins that you picked up at the grocery store, preferably ones that were not made with industrial oils, right? And maybe muffins at a bakery or something like that. But I mean, it doesn't have to be a huge production. And showing up how we authentically live in the world is really hard. And particularly for me as a food person, I mean, whenever people come over to my house, they think, oh, it's going to be amazing. And I'm going to be able to take pictures of everything and post them on Instagram.
I would think people would have these huge pictures in their mind at your house, or you would have that of yourself because you're such a food expert, right?
Yeah,
that'd be really hard to invite someone over.
Yes. And like our own expectations of ourselves are the worst, right? Just terrible. And when my kid was born and we started having people come over and they started calling them play dates, I was like, I don't know what a play date is, but do you want to come over? Like everything has to be categorized and boxed. And it's like.
And organized. Yes. You can't just have kids get together. We'll have a play date.
And it's the same thing for adults too. Like anything that is good for kids is usually good for adults too. Like eating with other people. We always talk about how important it is for kids to eat dinner together with people. It's important for us too.
Right. I wanted to change the subject just a little bit about those of us who eat meat and animal products.
Yep.
Can you give us some advice about that?
I can tell you what the science says.
Okay.
There's not a lot of science that is about meat specifically and its effect on your emotional well-being. There is science about cured meats like, cured bacon or salami or that kind of thing, that if you have that as in excess as part of your eating pattern, that it can affect your emotional well-being. Now, this is not saying don't eat bacon ever again or don't eat salami ever again. It's these studies tend to be people who eat a lot of them because you're trying to measure these things early on in the science. But as far as generally meat, dairy, that kind of thing, we're just at the science that shows us the importance of and the impact of the Mediterranean diet.
Okay.
Has fewer animal products and tends to lean towards fatty fish. So there's not a lot of evidence about animal products generally, but I can tell you there is a ton of evidence about DHA and EPA, which are omega-3 fatty acids that you can only get in fish. And that's because the fish don't naturally have it in their bodies. It's in the algae that they eat, right? So the teeny little fish eat the algae, and that's how they get DHA and EPA into themselves. And then the bigger fish eat the smaller fish, right? You just keep going on. And so what I saw through it, halfway across the world, I went to a lab and saw through their 2-photon microscopes how quickly your neurons connect if you have sufficient DHA and EPA and how slowly they connect if you don't. And this could be like just little milliseconds, like fractions, blink of an eye, that kind of thing. But it matters. And so one thing that I've started doing, I spent a lot of time at the end of Long Island, the east end of Long Island, and I eat a ton of seafood when I'm there. But when I'm not in an area that I eat a lot of seafood, I always take an omega-3 supplement, DHA and EPA. And it's kind of that and vitamin D in the winter are the only supplements that I take when, it's not frequent in my food pattern.
Interesting. Thank you.
But that's where the fatty fish provides that.
Yeah. And you can get omega-3 fatty acids from plants, but you can't get these specific kinds. You can only get them from fish and algae. I mean, if you eat seaweed and algae products, you can get it from that. But there's something about the availability in fish. So that's what I have to say about animal products.
So it's sort of like their microbiome. I mean, if they're eating the algae.
Yes. And that's the thing is like, this is such exciting research because we're starting to show that it's possible, but we don't know the mechanisms yet. There's no hope for a pill anytime soon. And I talked to a ton of researchers across the world, and every single one of them said, in our lifetime, in my son's lifetime, there will be nothing that will help you as much as a food pattern, as much as food can help you. And it's something we do several times a day, if you're me.
Right. Right. Yep, me too.
What kind of foods support our emotional well-being? Which ones don't?
Yeah. So within that Mediterranean diet, the most important thing is variety. There's something called the American Gut Project that is an ancestor of the Human Genome Project. Because after the human genome was mapped, as I said, we started looking into the gut microbiome. So the American Gut Project did a really interesting study that showed that people who eat 30 or more different kinds of plants a week have significantly better health outcomes, including mental health outcomes, than people who eat only 10 plants a week, 10 different kinds of plants. And before your mind goes like crazy, like 30 plants, what are you talking about? 10 plants a week, probably most Americans are at that, right? Corn, wheat, soybeans, lettuce, tomato, onion, bananas, right? So like the very standard thing that you could get on like a sandwich or something, or you can just like grab and go, that can be 10 plants or anything that's in our ultra processed food system.
I tend to forget that things like bread count as a plant
as
product.
A plant, yeah, absolutely. For purposes of the scientific study.
Okay.
So when you get to 30 different kinds, like I've incorporated wild rice. I love wild rice. It's so good. Not like long grain and wild rice, just like pure wild rice. And different kinds of vegetables will feed your gut microbiome better than focusing on, okay, I heard that berries are great. So now I'm going to eat berries every day. Because when you eat berries, like I'm going to eat blueberries every day. Okay, fine, great, fantastic. But it's often at the expense of some other food. And it's usually not at the expense of chips, right? It's usually at the expense of like, okay, well, I like raspberries, but I heard blueberries are great. So the diversity is really important. There's nothing that I can tell you that's like, again, eat 3 walnuts and you'll feel better in the morning. But there are certain superfoods that have more nutritional value per calorie, right? Like berries are very low calorie, very high in nutrients. Eat lots of berries, right? Nuts, Brazil nuts, almonds are great. Lentils, beans. I'm not going to tell you anything that you haven't heard before. It's all about the why. And as we discussed, you can know everything about the best way to eat and never do it. Most people who I know who have food struggles know all this stuff. They know what to eat. It's just very difficult to do it in the moment. And so having that different why that is science-backed about your emotional well-being, to me, was really important. And all of the research that's done showed that it is independent of weight loss. So you don't have to focus on weight loss, because I don't know about anybody else, but I'm sick of diet culture. And it is the worst thing possible for your emotional well-being to think that you'll be fine in 10 pounds instead of focusing on what you're doing today. Right? We want to improve our emotional well-being while not ruining our emotional well-being. So I try to focus on variety and vegetables and cutting down on ultra high processed foods.
I like the idea that there is no pill and there will be no pill in the foreseeable future that's going to do better than eating.
Jill, I want a pill. Right?
I know, we would all want a pill.
I want to eat an entire cake and take a pill and not feel like I just ate an entire cake, because cake is delicious. And
I want to figure out how to turn all these fruits and vegetables into my comfort foods.
Yeah. Well, one way to do it is that when you are in a joyful state, you start incorporating those foods into it. Right. So when you're celebrating something, it's not, oh, now you can't have ice cream. It's like, put some berries. If you really want ice cream, have the ice cream, put some berries on it, put some nuts on it. Like that kind of thing. It's about starting to incorporate it, which is why, it would be great if I could give you a 30-day plan for never eating sugar again. Right? Nobody can do that. We are born loving sugar. It is part of our biology. You put sugar on a baby's lip, they will start sucking on their lip like crazy because that's just part of our biology. So instead of being like, oh, well, I don't like that, so I'm going to deny that that's my biology. You can't, right? It's a fool's errand. So what you need to do is accept the biology and try to work with it. And that's the only way to lasting change.
Okay, that's great advice. So you mentioned that your book ends with a 4-week plan. And can you give us a quick overview of that?
Yeah. So science is great, but we're all individuals who need to make decisions every single day, every second of every day about what food we put in our bodies. And so I broke it down into the 4-week plan into each week focuses on one of the different evidence-proven ways that food affects your emotional well-being. So week 1 is all about food pleasure and increasing your food pleasure. It's about changing up your cutlery, listening to different music while you're eating, and just to see how it affects you. One of the studies that was done showed that when people ate stale chips, as predicted, they thought they were pretty gross, right? But then they piped in sounds of crunching noises, and the same people eating the same chips rated them as higher quality, as more delicious. And they ate more of them. And so it's just those kinds of interesting little things. There are a lot of tricks in there that chefs use because their entire livelihood depends on people enjoying their food. Then there's a week about inflammation, focusing on increasing foods that will help with inflammation and decreasing foods that don't or can cause inflammation. Then there's one focusing on nutrients. A lot of that focuses on omega-3 fatty acids, as I talked about. They're really well studied, but also things like when you're stressed, you need more magnesium. Magnesium leaks out. They studied the urine of stressed people and you find more magnesium in their urine. So, or zinc for depression. And then the 4th week is, the gut microbiome is about feeding your gut microbiome. So fiber, fermented foods. And during none of these weeks is it like, okay, so no sugar this week. I mean, as I said, it's a noble goal. And if you have that goal, great. And I support you in that goal. I just don't want anybody to feel awful if they don't reach it, because that's worse for your emotional well-being.
Well, that comes back to the food pleasure is, you're having a birthday. It's your kid's birthday and you have a cake. Most of us want to eat a piece of that cake because it's pleasurable. We like it and it is sugar, but once a year you have a birthday. I think that's probably it's eating cake every day that would be problematic.
And you might get more pleasure out of that piece of cake that you eat with your child around people who your child loves, and who support your child. I mean, that's a different, it's the same ingredients, right? But it's a different experience. And that's why I think for decades, people thought, well, I know anecdotally that food affects my emotional well-being, but there can't be any science about it because it's the same stuff, But we now have neuroscience that shows that our brains, as I said, flavor is created in the brain. Your brain will register that cake differently if you're eating it in that situation than if you're eating it in a different situation.
Wow. Well, your book has some fantastic recipes in it. And I really like the one about the fermented foods. And you also have the sheet pan recipe that we've actually talked about, something on this podcast about that. But I'm wondering, do you have any advice for those of us who cook at home and expand on what we do? Any tips that we could take home?
Like how do we become a better cook?
Yeah.
I mean, I'll go back to don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. That a lot of times when we think to ourselves, and I do this too, when we think to ourselves, this week I'm going to cook. Like that's going to be virtuous. I'm going to cook every meal all week and it's going to be great. And then you come up with 5 recipes and then you make the grocery list and then you go out and buy them. And then it's like you're just staring at the food in your fridge. And I get that, I've been there. I think understanding that you can make a great meal in 10 minutes and that you don't have to cook absolutely everything in it, or you don't have to chop everything yourself. I mean, there are amazing the salad bar is a great place, particularly if you live alone, because you can go to that salad. If you're focused on eating 30 different plants, in a week or in a week, that's a great place to just go. Cause it's like, oh, I haven't had beets in a while. You know, I'm not going to get roast a beet and, and I don't want to go to the can, but I'm going to get a little scoopful of beets and that's fine. It's more expensive, but it's more expensive than ultra high processed food, but it's less expensive than healthcare.
Right.
Well, it's also, you go and you buy a big package of spinach, and how much spinach do you eat in a week? So if you go and buy it on the salad bar, you're not throwing away half the package because you didn't have time to eat it all.
Yeah. And you're still living your experiment. I mean, what's going to happen to my emotional well-being if I try eating 30 different plants this week? How am I going to feel at the end of that? And just see. And then it becomes, if it's something that you experience like, oh yeah, I do feel a little better, then that's going to be the thing that motivates you to do more, because it's clear that a smaller pair of pans is not motivation enough and the whole paradigm of not eating to lose weight we're turning it on its head, because what we see from the gut microbiome, and I don't want to get too deeply into this and too deeply into the weight loss thing, but what we see from the gut microbiome, when you have identical twins, they still have different gut microbiomes because of all the things that affects your gut microbiome. But if you have identical twins and one is heavier and one is lighter in body weight, and you transfer their gut microbiomes, the heavier one will start losing weight and the lighter one will start gaining weight. And this is something that we've seen in mice, and there are a bunch of human studies that have been done about it too. So there's so much it's obviously calories in, calories out, but what happens with those calories inside of your particular body is going to be different than what happens to even your identical twin.
Wow. That's really interesting. Yeah, that makes sense too.
You're actually sort of I think you're saying that rather than focusing on your weight, focusing on eating well and actually,
what a concept, right?
Focus more on being a healthy person.
Yes.
Than being a thin person.
Yeah. Yes. And if you are thin, great. If you're not thin, great. Like there are all kinds of, and there are a million books out there that are written about weight and how it affects you. Go and read those. But what I can tell you is that for the studies that have been done about food and mental health, the improvements in emotional well-being happen independent of weight. Period.
Okay. That's good to know.
It's not that weight doesn't have anything to do with it, but these results happen independent of weight.
Okay. So you just talked about making something in 10 minutes. So when you come home after a busy day and you need to cook something for dinner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you have a recipe that you turn to, or do you have any advice on what we do to get a quick, healthy dinner?
I buy pre-cleaned vegetables and I throw them on a sheet pan into the oven and I roast them with a ton of olive oil in a really hot oven. And last night I ate it over wild rice. And wild rice is super easy because you don't have to measure anything out. You just boil the rice, you throw it in, and then you can strain the rice like pasta, right? And then I just threw a bunch of vegetables over wild rice. And then I had some tahini, sesame paste. And I made like a little, it just in a tiny little bowl. It wasn't like a big thing. It's like tahini, olive oil, garlic. And I put that over the top. And that is something that you can do. I mean, open the packages, put them on the sheet, put some olive oil on it, boil some water, put the rice in, and then that's 7 minutes of hands-on time. And that to me is like warm, fragrant, satisfying. There's fat in it, which I love.
That's great.
The olive oil and the tahini would have.
Yeah, it's really satisfying.
I love roasted vegetables. Yeah. So I want to remind our listeners that your book is called Eat and Flourish, and they can get it from bookstores everywhere. I highly recommend reading it. But besides your book, if our listeners want to get more information or follow you online, where should they go?
I'm on Instagram at mary.beth and on Twitter at Mary Beth. And I have a website, marybethalbright.com. So you can see some stuff there too.
Great. We'll make sure those links are in the show notes.
Terrific.
Thank you so much for talking with us today, Mary Beth. It's been such a pleasure.
Yeah, Jill and Chris, I really appreciate your time and your trust. It's two things that are in short supply these days. So,
well, it's great talking with you. You've been a fantastic guest.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Mary Beth had lots of good ideas. I'm going to have to think about ways to eat with others more often. I thought the idea of the importance of pleasure is something we don't often think about.
Right. I liked her 4 ideas. And the very first one was about pleasure, increasing the pleasure with cutlery and music. And I have to be honest, I don't ever think about that when I'm preparing food. I just think of the food, preparing to eat. I just think of the food, not really the surroundings.
You want to know what? When she was talking about you should put your ice cream in a bowl and not eat it out of the container, I was feeling very virtuous because I will sometimes take like my mother's old parfait glasses and I'll put my ice cream in it. And if I have any toppings, I put those on. I make it look really pretty. And then I sit and enjoy it. I was like, wow, I actually was doing something right.
Yeah. And I just think, how can I eliminate what dishes to wash, which is probably not the right choice for her. And then her other 3 evidence-proven ways about reducing inflammation, the nutrients, and she talked a lot about gut microbiomes too. So I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah. You know what? We've had a couple of guests now talk about this idea of eating 30 different plants in a week.
Right.
And what I liked was that she told us where that number came from. So it wasn't just totally random, but it was from a study by the American Gut Project.
Yeah.
I like that she told us where that number came from.
Yeah. It doesn't seem so random.
I've always had this feeling like just some guy on the internet made it up. I always like when we actually know that somebody actually...
that it has some research behind it. Yeah. Well, and I liked her hint about going to a salad bar to get some more, because it is a challenge buying all those different pieces and parts. So, that was clever.
I just discovered that the grocery store closest to me no longer has a salad bar.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Huh. Well, that's usually been my go-to. They not only had a salad bar, but they had an olive bar, mushroom bar.
Yeah, they still have the olive bar, but no salad bar anymore.
Interesting. Some things have to give. I don't know.
Yeah, other stores have it though, so I'll just go there.
That's right. Well, I'd love to hear what our listeners thought about today's talk. I think everyone hears different things, finds different things from these interviews, and I'd love to hear what you've heard.
Yes. Let us know if Mary Beth made you think about something a bit differently.
I want to remind everyone to follow us on our Facebook page and then join our private Facebook group where we encourage and support each other.
Definitely. You can also find us at becomingellie.com. That's our website. Or on Instagram, Twitter, Pinterest, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Mastodon.
It was great talking with you today, Jill. I'm looking forward to our next episode of the Fit Strong Women Over 50 podcast.
I am too. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.